Well, welcome back to our second study for today, study 4 in this series on reforming kings of Judah who failed. And we have in front of us, as we said in our last session, the tragedy of the failure of Asa after the invasion of Baasha, king of Israel. And we've just read 2 Chronicles chapter 16, which has introduced this study. We were told in verse 1 that it was in the 6th and 30th year of Asa's reign that these events occurred. When Baasha, king of Israel, came up against Judah. Now, I acknowledge that there are some issues with the chronology here, because if you actually sit down and do the chronology, it doesn't match up perfectly. But if anybody's ever done any work on the chronology of kings, and I've done a fair bit, if you have the answer to the chronology of kings, then you have a jewel, because I don't know anybody who does. Okay, I don't know anybody who's resolved it correctly and properly. So it's one of those things that's going to have to wait for the kingdom for me to to get an answer to some of the chronological difficulties. So I'm not going to even go into that. I want you to accept face value what I read and learn the lessons. And the important thing is to get the lessons out of this. We know that there was a long period of peace, and then these events occurred when Baasha of Israel got sick and tired of his people leaving his kingdom and going down to Judah. And he's going to do something about this. He's not going to tolerate this anymore. All these people flooding down to King Asa because there was great things going on down in Judah. They heard about what was happening down there and how this ecclesia was prospering and the whole nation was committed to the truth. They wanted to be part of it. The idiotic apostasy of Jeroboam going on in the north. So that's the story here, right? And he got sick of it. He said, I'm not going to have this happen anymore. So he's going to block the border between Israel and Judah so that people can't go down to live in Judah. So that's what we have here. A long period of peace and then these events. Now Baasha's name means in the Hebrew to stink. To stink offensively. And I don't think there's any doubt that that's his character. Right? Stinks. And he shows it in the way he behaves. And it says he built Ramah. Now, Ramah means a height. He's obviously going to choose high ground, aren't you? It's about 10 kilometres or 6 miles north of Jerusalem, and we passed it by yesterday on the road to Bethel and Shechem. It's a strategic town, obviously, very strategic town, as we know from the rest of the scripture, commanding a height, hence the name, overlooking the route to Jerusalem. So this is an ideal place to set up a barrier to people who are coming down from the north, because they're coming down the central massif of the land, the highway that's on the hilltops down through the mountains of Israel. It's the obvious place to be putting a barrier. So he selected this position because of its ideal strategic nature. That he might let none go out or come in to Asa. Okay? So he was resolved to stop this erosion of his subjects by force and by power. So moves the frontier down a little bit to command this defensible position at Ramah. When you come to verse 2, we read, Then Asa brought out silver and gold out of the treasures of the house of Yahweh. Now, we know what silver and gold represent, don't we? Silver's redemption. Gold is tried faith in the scripture. And this is a little key. It's telling you, it's a key element of what happened in his life. The principles that have to do with redemption and tried faith have faded away, right? Have actually faded away. And so he gives that away in order to make this league with the king of Syria. So being hard pressed, he's in a panic. He's lost his confidence in Yahweh. He's forgotten the things that happened 20 years before, right? There's a fundamental change of attitude during these years of peace. And if I had, and I'm known for making outlandish statements at times, but if I had to make a statement about our times in which we live, I think that's our problem. That's our basic problem. My parents grew up in the Depression and the Second World War. It produced a generation of people who wasted no opportunity. They wasted nothing, right? They were people diligent. This is the people who came out of those very hard conditions, who put their backs to the wheel, and they worked hard, right? Because they'd learnt not to waste opportunities of time. Yet we've grown up in a generation that has known nothing else but prosperity and laxity. And look at Australia, the fool's paradise where I come from. I used to go to America when I was still working for Pharaoh, and I would take my family over there, and I would say to people, "Oh, we're here for 5 weeks," and then I came home for 2 weeks, and then I got 5 weeks in the UK, and they'd say, "Really? How do you get 10 weeks off?" I said, "Oh, we get 3 months long service leave for every 10 years of service." Right? People, and the Americans shook their head and said, "Really? And we get 2 weeks leave, and if you've been working for a company for 10 or 15 years, you get 3 weeks. You never get any more than 4, right?" That's the way it might have changed now, but that was the way it was 20 years ago. Yeah. So, it's a totally different system. We live in the false paradise of Australia. All these public holidays and things, see, it doesn't do any good to anyone to have lax time, to time when what are you going to do? That doesn't do anybody any good. And I think part of our problems is because of the peace and the prosperity of our times. It certainly affected the life of King Asa, right? And there's a fundamental change in his psyche here. And it leads to terribly disastrous results for him personally, if not for his people. So what does he do? Verse 2 tells us he sent to Ben-Hadad, king of Syria, that dwelt at Damascus, saying, "There's a league between me and thee, as there was between me and my father, thee and my father." So who's this Ben-Hadad? Well, Ben, of course, son. Hadad, the thunderer, right? So he's the son of the thunderer. And of course, it's equivalent, this god, the Syrian god, to the Canaanite Baal, because it was the god of, the natural elements, the thunder and the lightning and the sun and all that sort of stuff. Now, Rezin was the founder of the Syrian kingdom based in Damascus. We know that from 1 Kings chapter 11, verses 23 and 24. And a number of kings followed him named Ben-Hadad. So it wasn't a personal name. It was a dynastic name like Pharaoh, because they were seen as the god, or at least the representative of their god. And so this man becomes the ally of King Asa, as he was with Abijah, Asa's father. So Syria, of course, was finally overthrown in 732 BC, which was 10 years before the overthrow of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC by the Assyrians. So moving on then to verse 3. "There is a league between me and thee." Now this word league is the Hebrew word berith, and we're all familiar with berith. It means to cut a covenant. And so Rotherham translates it, "Let there be a covenant between me and thee." So complete turnabout here, isn't there, from 2 Chronicles 15 verse 12? Because in 2 Chronicles 15 verse 12, they entered into a covenant to seek Yahweh, God of their fathers. Now they're entering into a covenant with a foreign king who can't really help. So what's the difference? How come? Well, they've forgotten. Asa has forgotten 2 Chronicles 15 verse 2. It's as simple as that. 2 Chronicles 15 verse 2. "Yahweh is with you while you be with him. You forsake him, he's got no option but to forsake you." And that's what happens here. Now, what does he say here in verse 3 of chapter 16 about a league? We don't know anything about this league that appears to have been with Abijah and the king of Syria. So it's evident that had happened, and it teaches us a very important lesson. The one thing that becomes very obvious when you do any study of the scriptures is that what fathers do influences what sons do. So Abraham told lies twice, right? Guess what Isaac ended up doing? The only sin or problem recorded of Isaac, because he's a type of Christ, but the only problem recorded of Isaac is that he told lies about his wife, okay? Which is exactly what his father did. And you go through scripture and you find that what the father allows is very often what the son will allow. So the lesson of that is the father's example, the parent's example, is critical to the way the children are going to behave down the track. If mum and dad have problems and difficulties and get divorced and remarry, what do you reckon the children are going to do? Okay? How many cases have you seen of that? I've seen a lot of them. But if mum and dad affirm that the covenant made in marriage is for life, or until Christ comes, then what do you reckon the children are going to do? In the most case, they hold to it. We've got problems in our own family, but there's no divorce and remarriage in our family, because our children know full well they get no support from mum and dad, right? But if mum and dad have done it, the children end up doing it. That's the way it works. Okay, so what the parents do is critical to outcomes in the life of children. That's the lesson here, right? So we don't hear about this league between Abijah, who only reigned for 3 years, and the king of Syria. But it must have happened, and Asa saw it and think, well, if Dad did it, I can do it. Right? That's the failure here. Go break thy league with Baasha, he says. Now, he ought to realise that if Ben-Hadad could break his league with the king of Israel, then he can break his league with the king of Judah. See, that's the simplicity of it. Yahweh was the only one who would not forsake his part in a covenant. He will never go back on his covenants. And we come to verse 4. And Ben-Hadad hearkened unto King Asa, and sent the captains of his armies against the cities of Israel. And they smote Ijon and Dan and Abel Beth-maim, and all the store cities of Naphtali, right up in the north of the land. All right, so it was doubtless for reasons of self-interest that Ben-Hadad decided that it was politically expedient to break his league with Baasha. He'd do better if he had a league with the king of Judah. So he gave Asa temporary relief from the problems, because obviously Baasha had to break off his campaign in the south and do something about the problems in the north. And that's where Ijon is, way up in the north. You know what Ijon means? Ruin. Dan, what does that mean? Judgment. These are not good omens, are they? This is not good omens. Now, Jeroboam's idolatrous calf worship was installed in the city of Dan in the north. And Abijah had captured Bethel, 2 Chronicles 13 verse 19, and now Asa, through the agency of Ben-Hadad, took Dan. The other town named here is Abel-maim. It means the meadow of water. It's called actually Abel Beth Maacah in the companion account of 1 Kings 15 and verse 13. And Abel Beth Maacah means meadow of the house of depression. So whether you look at ruin, Ijon, or judgment, Dan, or the meadow of the house of depression, the message is not all that good, is it? Because that's exactly where Asa ended up. Ruined, judged, and in the house of depression, from which he never recovered. Now, that's the lesson that comes out of this. You muck around with the world, you make covenants with the world, this is where you end up. Right? You forsake Yahweh to seek help from the world, you're gone. These were store cities, and they ended up being emptied. Rotherham says storehouses of the cities. So all of the produce that they had put into their storehouses was gone. And all of the background, the produce that Asa had built up, was going to be taken from him. So what happened in the north was going to happen in the south. In 2 Chronicles chapter 16 and verse 5 we read this. Baasha responds. It came to pass when Baasha heard it that he left off building of Ramah and let his work cease. He's forced to abandon his project so he does what he can to halt the Syrian progress in the north. And then we read that he goes and dwells in Tirzah, 1 Kings 15 verse 21. Now that's of interest to us because God willing on Monday, if it works out that we get into the West Bank, then we want to go and actually visit Tirzah because it was the capital for a time of the northern kingdom of Israel until the time of Omri, which we'll come to in our studies. So verse 6, what is Asa's response? Asa the king took all Judah. I wonder why he couldn't take all Judah up to oppose Baasha's invasion. Wouldn't that make more sense, you think? He waits until the Syrians do his job for him, and then he takes all Judah. Okay, that's quite amazing, isn't it? Well, the answer as to the reason why he didn't do that initially is given to us in Jeremiah 41. So I just want you to, if you would, hold your hand or pop something in 2 Chronicles 16 and come to Jeremiah 41 and verse 9. Now this is what I like about the scriptures because long time later you get a commentary on what happened in the past. In Jeremiah 41, you know, it's an aside in a sense because there's another disaster that happens here. This is the time, remember, when Ishmael comes along and slays a whole heap of people, including the governor, Gedaliah, the governor of Judah, that the Babylonians left in charge, okay? to look after Jeremiah and the remnant of the people. Along comes Ishmael with his crowd of 10 men, and they slay all of these people. And we read in verse 9 of Jeremiah 41 where they threw them. It says in verse 9, "Now the pit wherein Ishmael had cast all the dead bodies of the men whom he had slain because of Gedaliah, or near Gedaliah," so this is that slaughter that's recorded earlier in the chapter, "was it which Asa the king had made," look at the words, "for fear of Baasha king of Israel. And Ishmael the son of Nethaniah filled it with them that were slain." So Asa got all of Israel, all of Judah, and he brought them up where the Baasha had made this border to the land, and he got them trench digging. They all had their shovels, and they dug this huge trench, sort of obviously as a barrier to future invasion, see? Well, later on, it was used as a grave. Asa was actually digging his own grave. You know, he'd put his trust in a foreign king. He's actually digging his own grave. And he was acting out of fear. It could have been so different, couldn't it? Could have been so different if he'd just gone back to where he was in chapter 14 when 1 million men came against them. Did he fear then? Well, there was certain fear. But where did he go for help? To Yahweh. And there was a massive victory. Now it's a complete opposite situation. He's fearful of this king in the north who doesn't have the power to overcome him anyway. And he goes to Syria, and this is the end result. Sad, very sad. He takes the stuff that Baasha was using and he built there with Geba. Geba means a hill, a hillock. Okay, so we're back in the record now, 2 Chronicles 16 and verse 6. He built Geba, the hillock, and Mizpah, it says at the end of verse 6. And Mizpah means an observatory. This is a place like a watchtower where you get up and you observe. So you've got a hill, another hill, all right, and this one's used as an observatory. See any approaching army. Now, Geba was about 3 kilometres, 2 miles northeast of Ramah, and Mizpah is situated some 5 kilometres or 3 miles north of Ramah, and he builds it with materials from Baasha's work a little bit further south. So they carry all this stuff up, a couple of miles, 2 or 3 miles up, all this stuff from where Baasha was building his fortifications, and they fortify these places of defence. Now, if he could do all of that, why couldn't he have got all Judah together and gone up with his army and stared down Baasha? Well, he could have, putting his trust in Yahweh, but he didn't. So what does God do when these things happen in our life, when we show a lack of faith and trust in him? What does he do? Well, he tries hard to turn us around. He tries very hard to turn us around. So what does he do? He sends a prophet. Look at verse 7. And at that time, Hanani the seer came to Asa, king of Judah. Now, Hanani means gracious. And I think that's appropriate, isn't it? The prophet that came some 20 odd years before was Azariah, the son of Oded. So God chooses another prophet because I think of his name. His name is gracious. Now, in those days they knew the meaning of their names. We don't know, a lot of people today don't know the meaning of their names. But in those days they did, because it's part of the Hebrew language, see. So when this man walks in the door of Asa's palace, Hanani, he knows the man's name means gracious. And when the message comes from Yahweh, what would you assume? Well, you assume this is God's grace being shown towards me, isn't it? That's not the way it happens, because of human nature. Human pride gets in the way here. So we see that Hanani, and it then says, does it say the prophet in your Bible? No, it says the seer. You know what a seer is? Well, look at the word in the English. It's a seer. It's someone who sees. And guess what his message is in verse 9? The eyes of Yahweh run to and fro through the earth, see? So here's God's graciousness shown through a seer, someone who's seeing on his behalf. And goes on to say, he came to Asa, king of Judah, and said unto him, because thou hast relied on the king of Syria, and not relied on Yahweh thy God. Therefore is the host of the king of Syria escaped out of thine hand. Now, there's a lot in that verse. We considered portion of it, didn't we, in our study yesterday, our final study yesterday. And that's the word Shayan, and I'm sure that some of you by now have highlighted the occurrences of this. We met it back in verse 11 of chapter 14, and here we've got it twice in verse 7 and again in verse 8 of chapter 16. It means to support oneself. It's translated rest in chapter 14, verse 11, and relied in verse 7, and rely in verse 8. That's our word, okay? And that's very, very important, because this is why he has a problem. He had lent upon Yahweh in crisis before. It worked. Great things came out of it. Now he's gone the exact opposite. It's the antithesis of what he did. He's relied upon human help, human strength, and not upon his God. Now, I find the final statement of verse 7 very interesting, because it just comes out of the blue. He says to him, therefore, because you relied upon human help, the Syrian king, and not Yahweh, therefore the host of the king of Syria escaped out of thine hand. Really? Yes. You see, we don't know what God's plan is for tomorrow, do we? For you and me. We don't know what the plan is for a year's time or 2 years' time for you and me. What we got to do is the right thing. And we do the right thing, then his plans can come to pass. We do the wrong thing, his plans are shattered. He had a plan for Judah to deal with the nation of Syria. But it wasn't going to happen now, was it? I think all the problems would come out of that. Because, you see, God wanted to deal with Syria through Asa so that the problems wouldn't accrue for Judah in the future. But because he has failed and gone and made a league with Syria, that's not going to happen anymore. So he's undermined the divine plans for him. How often do we do that? How often do we do that? Not doing the right thing, plans God has for us don't come to pass. There's a great lesson in that. All right? It's just popped in there, all right, as a lesson for us. I think that's very important. We come to verse 8, and here the prophet reminds him of the victory over Zerah the Ethiopian. Were not the Ethiopians and the Lubims, the Libyans, okay, the primitive Libyans, who were allied at the time with the Ethiopians, who were just south of Egypt, modern Sudan today, by the way, not modern Ethiopia. And in verse 9 he goes on to say, we'll read the rest of verse 8, the Ethiopians and the Libyans, a huge host with very many chariots and horsemen. Yet because thou didst rely, there's our word Shayan, on Yahweh, he delivered them into thine hand. And then we've got, I think, this is a terrific passage. This is a little bit like 2 Chronicles 15 verse 2. It's one of those timeless principles, isn't it? The AV says, for the eyes of Yahweh run to and fro throughout the whole earth, to show himself strong in behalf of them whose heart is perfect toward him. Now we'll stop there and just consider what this really is all about. Now, we know who the eyes of Yahweh are. They're the angels, aren't they? And they're the prophets, like Hananiah the seer. He was part of the eyes of Yahweh. But the angels are the eyes of Yahweh. They're the ones that are sent forth to minister to the heirs of salvation. So they're always there, as I said yesterday. So Rotherham's translation, I think, is helpful. He says, for as touching Yahweh seeing, that his eyes are ever running to and fro throughout the earth. Okay? It's the principle of chapter 15, verse 2, all over again, isn't it? That had been forgotten. If you seek Yahweh, you will find him, all right? Because his eyes are always there. And he's there for a reason. He's there to support those whose heart is perfect towards him. Now, that word perfect is our word shalom, remember? It means, it's got that idea of safety, all right? But because you've got safety, you've got security, you've got completeness, see? So the root of that word is very important, to be safe. But Asa did not acknowledge the gods of Syria, we know that. But his heart was wobbly when it came to confidence in Yahweh. Herein thou hast done foolishly, says the end of verse 9. Therefore from henceforth thou shalt have wars. The word foolishly there means to be silly. And it's a silly act, isn't it? Now Asa was not a fool, we know that. But in this matter, he had acted very foolishly, and that, of course, is typical of human nature. You can have a very sensible person, and all of a sudden something stupid happens in their life, and you think, what's happening here? That's human nature. I know a little bit about that. I think you know a little bit about that, you know. Most of the time, you know, we're sensible, aren't we? But then you get these stupid actions, you think to yourself, what on earth is going on here? Right? And that's what's happened. And the reason it's happening here is because of a lack of intensity and faith. All right? His faith has dropped away. The intensity of that faith has dropped away. And of course, one thing leads to another, because there's two ways to respond to a rebuke like this, isn't there? You can either humble yourself, like Hezekiah did, remember? You know, when he showed the Babylonians all of his kingdom, and he's going around, you know, God's greatly blessed us, and look at all this. The Catholics were in there looking at the ecclesia. And the prophet comes and says, you're an idiot. Really? Yeah, you're an idiot. Because these Babylonians are going to come and take you and your children away. And he said, yeah, I've messed up big time. I really have messed up. And of course God says, well, it's not going to happen in your day because I'm forgiving. All right? It'll happen to your children because they won't be like you. Okay? But for you, it's not going to happen in your day. Now that's the God we serve. All right? It's all about our reaction, our response to him. And so if we humble ourselves under the mighty hand of God, he will exalt us in due time and he will get us through our problems. But if we're like Asa in this case, and our human pride says, you're not going to tell me anything, all right? I'm not going to, I don't think I've done anything wrong here. That's your attitude, this is what happens to you. So that's why this is very important. Because he says, thou shalt have wars. So it's the antithesis of Asa's previous experience in which God had given him peace for his faith and righteousness. Now he had trusted in the flesh, he was to be punished, and there was to be continual war, in other words, trouble from the flesh. And that's the way it works. In verse 10 we read, then Asa was wroth with the seer and put him in the prison house. So here he is, he manifests this human pride in the hour of crisis. The younger Asa would have humbled himself, acknowledged his mistake, but the grounds of humility were gone. And wounded pride prevented him from taking appropriate action and hearing the rebuke. And I think it would be worthwhile just to look at these proverbs. There's two on the screen there in front of you. No, there's three on the screen there. Let's just have a look at three, and I'll add one to it when we're there. So just pop something in Chronicles. Come to Proverbs chapter 9, verse 8. Let's have a look at the Proverbs that remind us of the principle involved here. Proverbs 9 and verse 8. Where we read, reprove not a scorner, lest he hate thee. Rebuke a wise man, and he will love thee. You reckon that's true? Yeah. You got someone who's wise, known for their wisdom and their stability in life, but they make a mistake, and you go along and say, look, brother, I've got a great respect for you, but you messed up on that one. You don't always get the right response, do you? But a really wise man says, you know, you're right. I have messed up on that one. And they'll humble themselves. It's not easy for human nature to do that because of human pride. I'll tell you something, brethren and sisters. At my age, you learn this, okay? When I was younger, my biggest problem was the lust of the flesh. And it usually came in the form of the opposite sex, okay? When I got a little older, you know, things have stabilised in life. My problem was the lust of the eyes. You know, maybe I want that, maybe I want this. They're all gone. No, they're not all gone, but they're largely, you know, they're in the background. They're not a huge problem for me anymore. I'll tell you what my biggest problem is, and will be to the day I die. Human pride. It's the third in the list because it's the last major hurdle for us to overcome. Human pride. It has brought down some great men. Ahithophel, no less, right? And many, many others. It's brought them down. So we've got to recognise this fact, that this is what can get in the way between us and eternal life. got in the way of King Asa. Right? Human pride. You rebuke a really wise man and he'll humble himself. Come to Proverbs 12 and verse 1. Whoso loveth instruction loveth knowledge, but he that hateth reproof is like an animal. He's brutish. It's the cleaner. So he that hates reproof is like an animal, says the proverb. Come to 29 and verse 1. That's pretty close to the other reference that I want to make. Now, if you're like me, the Word of God's going to rebuke you pretty often, okay? And verse 1 reminds us of what can happen. He, you know what that word he is in the Hebrew? Ish. Now normally it would be rendered man. It actually means a great man or a mighty man, in contrast to an Adam or to an Enosh, a weak mortal man. It's got to do with a man who's progressed. So in the eyes of God, he's mighty in the sense that he's a spiritual man, see? He's climbed the echelon, spiritual echelon, the ladder. So that's the word that is used here. Ish, he, that being often reproved, which is what the word of God does, hardeneth his neck. Now the word hardness means to be dense, tough. It's used in the word that is translated stiff-necked, okay? Now what's the neck about? Well, the word neck actually doesn't necessarily mean just the neck. It means the back of the neck. It's the area around near the shoulders. See, it's where you put a yoke. And the idea of that is responsibility, accepting responsibility, carrying the weights. Now, if you get to a point where you're being so often reproved, and you think, hardening, you actually become stiff-necked. You've actually set yourself against God. Doesn't lead to a very good place. It says, he shall suddenly be destroyed at the judgment seat, and that without remedy. And without remedy means there's no cure. All right? There's no cure for this. You get hard-hearted, there's no cure. So we got to avoid this like the plague, don't we? So we're in the area. Just cast your eyes across to Proverbs 28, verse 13. Because this is Asa's problem. He that covereth his sins, and the word sins is revolt, it's pesha in the Hebrew, means revolt or rebellion, and that's what Asa's doing here, right? He that covereth his revolt shall not prosper, but whoso confesseth and forsaketh them shall have mercy. It doesn't say he might have mercy, does it? It means he will have mercy. In other words, God is perfectly consistent with his character. If we acknowledge his righteousness, he can't do anything else but forgive. It's not in him. I cannot forgive you. All right? You can come to me and plead with me. Please forgive me. And I can be hard-hearted and say, get out of here. I'm not interested. God can't. It is not in his character to do so. All right? That's very, very important lesson. Goes on to say this in verse 14. Happy is the Adam, and that's what the word is, and we're all Adams, aren't we? Happy is the Adam that feareth always. And by the way, that word always is the word that is used right throughout the law of Moses that is normally rendered continually. All right? It's the word that has to do with the continual burnt offering, continual burning of the lamps and so on. That's the word. But he that hardeneth, this is our word quashar that we saw in chapter 29, verse 1, he that hardeneth his heart shall fall into mischief. It's exactly what happened to King Asa of Judah. Now let's come back to chapter 16. So he was wroth with the divine messenger, the man whose name is gracious. Wounded pride was at work. So what does he do with him? Verse 10. Well, he put him in the prison house. Now, this is important because this is not a great translation. This word prison house is marpiketh in the Hebrew. It actually means a wrench. It's a reference to the stocks. Now, you know what stocks are. If you've been to the UK, you've been to Ireland, you've seen out in the parks, they got these stocks, you know, the little holes where your legs or your arms went or whatever. Well, this is one for the legs. So they sat you on a seat, they put your legs out, they clamped down the top thing and locked it, and you're in the stocks. So what's the problem? Well, you can't go anywhere. Your feet have been bound. So here is Asa binding the feet of God's prophet. So his judgment is poetic. All right. It's poetic because God struck him with a disease in his feet. You bind my word, you bind the feet of my prophet, I'm going to strike you in your feet, which represent your walk. You don't listen to my word, then your walk is going to be corrupted. All right. That's the simple message of this. And come to verse 12. We'll just read down verse 11. Look, we need to go back to the last sentence of verse 10, really, don't we? Because it says he was in a rage with him because of this thing, and Asa oppressed some of the people at the same time. So why do you think he did that? Well, because they agreed with the prophet, didn't they? They supported the words of the prophet. Have you ever seen this happen in ecclesial life? When someone stands up and says something that's perfectly true, but it's not what the ecclesia wants to hear, all right? And you get some people saying, hey, listen, he's right. And the others say, well, get out of here. All right? That's exactly what happens here. He oppresses those who supported the words of Hanani. Not a great thing to do. And of course, it's going to rebound on you, isn't it? Look at verse 11. It's sad, isn't it, when you see it? And behold the axe. Notice this? The axe. Our destiny will be determined by our axe. That's what will determine our destiny. The acts of Asa, first and last, lo, they are written in the book of the kings of Judah and Israel. And Asa in the 39th year of his reign. Now that was 3 years after the events of verse 10, because we know it was the 36th year, okay? So it's 3 years after that. Wonder why 39 comes up here. Well, when I went to school, 39 was 3 times 13. 13 is the biblical number for rebellion. And 3 is the number for fruit, result and outcomes. All right? This is the outcome of rebellion. That's what we're being told here. The 39th year. The outcome of rebellion. It's a tragic outcome, isn't it? 39th year of his reign, he was diseased in his feet until his disease was exceeding great. You know, this word diseased here is chala in the Hebrew. It means weak or sick. It comes from the root to be rubbed or worn. So his feet ended up as though he was 150 years old, right? And he couldn't use them. There's some kind of disease, he couldn't use his feet. His walk is corrupted. That's what it signifies. And it says it was exceeding great. Rotherham says it was exceedingly severe. So the punishment fitted the crime. You bind the prophet's feet, this is what's going to happen to you. Scriptural history, of course, shows that divine judgments are often poetic. And we're going to see the most, and I'll tell you this, this is not an exaggeration. In our subsequent studies, God willing, we come to Joash, you are going to see the most exquisite case in the whole of the Bible of poetic justice. All right. We'll see it in the life of King Joash. That'll come down the track, God willing. But what did he do? Did he humble himself? Did he say, well, I've got a real problem here. I really do need to go back to God? No. It says at the end of verse 12, yet in his disease he sought not to Yahweh but to the physicians, and that's exactly what his name means. In other words, he went to the help of man again, like he had done when he went to the king of Syria. He went to the help of man, not to the help of Yahweh, who's the true physician, Yahweh Rafika. of Exodus chapter 15. What a sad case this is. Self-help. That's what it really represents. 2 Chronicles 16 verse 14. We read of him. And they buried him in his own sepulchres, which he had made for himself. It's like digging his own grave, isn't it? Rotherham says, in his own stately sepulchre, which he had hewn for himself. So he prepared well for his death because he knew it was coming. What a tragedy that a man with such a record should die with the symbol of a corrupt walk. And they made sweet odours for him. See there it says in the middle of verse 14, they made sweet odours. Now in those times it was a common practice to embalm the body with sweet spices. They did that with the body of our Lord, didn't they? Right, so that was not an uncommon practice. In Asa's case, they might have used those spices to try and sort of, get rid of the terrible odour of the corruption of his feet, which brought him to his end, probably occasioned his death. And he goes on to say, of course, that they made a very great burning for him. You can put all sorts of spices on the flesh, it's not going to do any good, is it? If there's spiritual corruption. So you can't dress it up, you can't pretty it up. This is just a very, very sad case. Nothing can arrest the progress of mortal corruption but the power of God. And this Asa had refused. It says, at the end of verse 14, spices were prepared by the apothecary's art. Now, I was fascinated when I went to Zurich and walked around Zurich that they actually call pharmacies, or we call them chemists' shops in Australia, they call them apothecaries or whatever, so they still use this word apothecary, which of course has got to do with the word it is talking here about what a chemist does and make up an aromatic unguent, or as Rotherham puts it, the perfumer's art. So there's like a chemist, the mixture of certain spices. And it says they made a very great burning for him. So he was deeply mourned by his long-suffering people. Even those he oppressed, they deeply mourned the passing of this man out of respect. And there's another very important lesson here. I mean, I don't need to tell you, and we've had some classic cases of failure amongst some very prominent people in our community. There's nothing new about that. It happened in Old Testament times, it happened in New Testament times, so why wouldn't it happen in latter days? Right? But it's disappointing, isn't it? It's very disappointing when you got brethren that we look up to and respect because of what they've done for us. And then all of a sudden their wheels fall off and it's it's a very ugly situation. But I've observed basically two outcomes to that. Okay? We've got the younger generation who are using it, and we've got some ex-Christadelphians on the internet using it as the basis for the rest of us to forsake the truth. Okay? Well, that's not on, is it? We're not going to do that. And there's the other reaction. I've gone around and the brethren have said to me, have you got the address of brother so-and-so? Because I'd like to write to him and see where he's up to. All right? Now, they're not, these brethren want no part. They're not going to compromise with the actions of brethren who have done seriously bad things. They're not compromising with that. They call it for what it is, right? And so we should. We should call it for what it is. But that doesn't mean you can't still have respect and honour for what that brother had accomplished before he failed, okay? So that's the lesson we've got to learn out of this. So that if someone does fail, it could be me, it could be you, okay? Think about what that brother might have done for you, that brother or sister might have done for you, and treat them with some degree of respect for what they have done. And that's what his people do, all right? They show him honour and respect, even though they saw the tragedy of his end. So what does it mean? They made a very great burning for him. Well, some people think it means they cremated him. Did you know that? And some people even use it as a justification for cremation today. You don't read about cremation. That was a pagan way of ending people's existence, right? The Bible speaks about putting you back in the ground. where you belong, not in a furnace, okay? Put them back in the ground where you came from. So what does it mean? Well, we can find out what it means. So come with me to a very important passage. Is this great burning a reference to cremation? No. 2 Chronicles 21. We're not very far from it. 2 Chronicles 21 and verse 19. Now this chapter is about Jehoram, the son of Jehoshaphat. Jehoram was the one who married Athaliah. It'll come up in our studies in due course. Athaliah, of course, was the daughter of at least Ahab, if not Jezebel. Probably both. Okay, and a woman of great evil. She ruled Judah for 6 years. Okay, so she was married to Jehoram, son of Jehoshaphat. Jehoram reigned for 12 years, not all of those on his own. There was some of it was as a co-regent with his father Jehoshaphat. But he was corrupt. And so what did God do to him? Well, he corrupted him. Have a look what happens in, let's read the verse 18 of 2 Chronicles 21. Because of his ungodliness, his idolatry, etc. And after all this, Yahweh smote him in his bowels with an incurable disease. And it came to pass that in process of time, after the end of 2 years, his bowels fell out by reason of his sickness, so that he died of sore diseases. Now let's stop there for a second. It's probably clear that he had dysentery. All right. In those days they weren't able to cure these sorts of things. He had dysentery. And what that means is that when you ate, it went straight through you. And every time he ate or drank, straight through you. To the point where it got to the stage where his bowels, his stomach got sick of this and it came out the back end. A portion of his stomach came out the back end. Not a comfortable way to go, because this went on for 2 years. Can you imagine the corruption, the odour, the stench of his death? So if anybody was going to be cremated to get rid of the stench of corruption, which is what some people suggest about Asa's death, right? They think that because of the corruption of his feet that they burned him to get rid of the corruption. If anybody was going to be burnt, it'd be Jehoram, wouldn't it? So what does it say about him? Look at the end of verse 19. It says this, and his people made no burning for him, like the burning of his fathers. So the burning is not about cremation. It's about respect. It's about honour. Okay? That's why they burnt, made a great burning for them, to show their respect for this individual. There was no respect. You know what it says about this man? He departed without being desired. Well, look, the worst thing that could happen to me is if my people, my family and my friends among our people said, when I die, I'm glad he's gone. I mean, wouldn't that be awful? To depart without being desired? Well, that's what happened to him. They made no burning for him. What a sad case, eh? That Asa ended up like he did. So what do we learn from this? In conclusion, well, we've got to carry away this principle of 2 Chronicles 15 verse 2, because he didn't. Yahweh is with you while you be with him. And if you seek him, he will, no if, buts or maybes, he will be found of you. But if you forsake him, he will forsake you. I think Peter, in his epistle, 1 Peter 5 verse 6, sums this up perfectly. Because this is what Asa didn't do. He forgot 2 Chronicles 15 verse 2. And when the crisis came and he was rebuked, he forgot this. Peter says, humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God. And the mighty hand of God, instead of it says under that hand, what that means is that the hand's on you. In other words, there's problems, there's things happen in your life. The hand's on you. Humble yourselves therefore under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time. You know what Peter then says at the end of his epistle? He says, you're going to have trouble, and they did have trouble in his time, didn't they? You're going to have trouble, but when God is ready, he will strengthen you, and he will settle you, and he'll give you peace. All right? It's not going to go on forever. But you've got to humble yourself under that mighty hand. Sadly, Asa didn't. There's a great lesson for us to carry away. But in the wake of his failure, Judah continues to be spiritually prosperous. Wonder why? Well, there was a great teaching priest there named Jehoiada, who's going to play a big part in what follows in the history of this nation. A faithful teaching priest who will come to prominence in the times of Joash, king of Judah. Another reforming king under Jehoiada who failed, just like King Asa. So God willing, tomorrow we'll pick this up again with our fifth study. So once we've done the fifth study, we'll be halfway through our series of 10 studies on reforming kings of Judah. And we'll have a look at Asa's wonderful son, Jehoshaphat, the reformer, and the success of his policies, the policies of his father, the early policies of his father, and see where they led to in the nation of Judah.